They didn't mean to hurt you, but they did. Not with fists, not always with words, but with absence, with silence, with a kind of subtle betrayal that doesn't leave bruises, only questions. Why am I like this? Why does love feel like pressure? Why do I always flinch when someone sees too much of me? It wasn't your fault, and it wasn't theirs. Because family pain is not about fault. It's about patterns, unconscious, inherited, recycled trauma, handed down like heirlooms nobody wants to admit they own. Shaped not by intention but by survival, passed from mouth to mouth, heart to heart, not as love, but as law. Be small, be good, be silent, be strong, be what we need you to be, not what you are. And so, without asking, you were drafted into a script that wasn't yours, a role written before you were born, cast in a system designed not to nurture your soul, but to maintain control. You were told who to be before you ever learned who you are. Taught to confuse love with obligation, loyalty with silence, and self-worth with performance. Because they were to your parents, their parents, the ones before them, all trained by the same unspoken code. Don't feel too much. Don't speak too loud. Don't look too deep. Because if you do, you might see it all. The fragility, the fear, the broken machinery hidden beneath generations of smiles and photo albums. Carl Jung called it the family shadow, the collective pain we inherit, suppress, and project. And if you don't face it, you become it. You echo the same phrases, the same reactions, the same emotional choreography. You raise your voice the way they did. You shut down the way they did. You give love with conditions because that's how you received it. And yet, somewhere inside you, something felt off. You knew this couldn't be the whole story. You knew that love wasn't supposed to cost your identity. You knew that family didn't mean forfeiting your soul. So you began to question, to step back, to pull at the threads of tradition and see what unraveled. And what you found wasn't evil, it was exhaustion. You saw tired hearts doing what they were taught. You saw people too wounded to hold what they never received. You saw children in adult bodies clinging to control because chaos was the only thing they'd ever known. It wasn't about blame. It was about truth. Because truth is the only thing strong enough to break the chain. And the truth is this: you are not broken. You are patterned. And patterns can be rewritten, not by pointing fingers, but by opening eyes, by sitting with the pain you were told to ignore, by breathing through the rage you were taught to swallow, by feeling what they could not bear to feel and refusing to pass it forward. This is the revolution, not rebellion, not rejection, but radical awareness, the kind that stops the script mid-scene and rewrites the ending, the kind that turns silence into speech, obligation into boundaries, fear into presence. Because once you see the pattern, you are no longer trapped by it. You no longer flinch when someone raises their voice. You understand where that voice was born. You no longer crumble when love withdraws. You know that love is not currency, it is connection. You no longer need to prove yourself to people who can't even find themselves. Because you've seen it now, the machinery behind the myth of the perfect family, the myth that pain equals punishment, the myth that you owe anyone the destruction of your spirit just to maintain peace. You don't, you never did. And now you become the anomaly, the interruption, the one who doesn't look away, the one who feels it all, shame, grief, confusion, and refuses to turn it into bitterness. You alchemize it. You hold the mirror not to shame, but to see. You ask the questions they couldn't. You weep the tears they buried. You forgive, not to forget, but to release the grip their pain had on your path. And that forgiveness, it is not weakness. It is spiritual rebellion, because to forgive without excusing, to see clearly without condemning, to love without losing yourself, that is the work of the awakened. And you are awake now, awake to the inheritance that shaped you, awake to the truth that frees you, awake to the path that begins not in their approval, but in your decision. To live, to feel, to rebuild, not on top of the rubble, but from within it, stone by stone, choice by choice. You craft a new legacy, not one of perfection, but of presence, not one of compliance, but of consciousness, not one where pain is hidden, but where it is held, honored, and healed. Because family pain was never the end of your story. It was the beginning of your awakening. So you begin to listen differently, not to the words they say, but to the words they don't. You hear it in the pauses, in the sudden subject changes, in the hollow laughs and quick dismissals. You begin to notice the choreography of avoidance, how pain moves in circles, never lines, how grief becomes sarcasm, how longing hides beneath indifference, how we don't talk about that becomes a family motto passed down like a sacred hymn. You realize silence isn't absence, it's code, and you've been decoding it your entire life. Noticing who's allowed to speak, who gets interrupted, who never cries, who drinks instead of talks, who smiles the most and listens the least. It's all information, emotional cartography. And you, whether you knew it or not, were born to read it. Because you didn't just inherit their features, you inherited their unfinished sentences, their unshed tears, their half-buried truths. You are the living continuation of what they couldn't resolve. And that doesn't mean you owe them resolution. It means you carry the opportunity for something different. And opportunity is not easy. It's not soft. It's sharp, demanding, lonely, because walking away from a pattern often means walking alone. Not forever, but for long enough to remember your own rhythm. Long enough to detox from dynamics that reward obedience and punish authenticity. Long enough to distinguish your real voice from the echoes of generations. You find yourself withdrawing, not out of resentment, but restoration, not as an act of punishment, but as an act of protection, because your energy now is sacred. You've seen what it costs to live out of sync with your truth. You've paid for it in anxiety, in broken relationships, in exhaustion masked as empathy. So now you guard your spirit. You are no longer available for roles you never auditioned for. The fixer, the emotional sponge, the quiet one, the scapegoat, the golden child. You resign from every archetype that requires your self-abandonment. And as you do, the room changes. Some look at you with confusion, some with disappointment, some with admiration they're not ready to express. Because when you stop playing your part, the entire production begins to shake. You're not rebelling against the family. You're rebelling against the lie that love must hurt, that peace must be paid for in silence, that maturity means martyrdom. You know better now. Because maturity isn't measured by how much you tolerate, it's measured by how honestly you live. And honesty is your new compass. Even when it shakes the foundation, even when it empties the room, even when it breaks the narrative wide open and leaves only raw truth on the table. Because now you understand, not every mess needs to be cleaned. Some need to be seen. And what is seen can be healed. Not by pretending, but by presence. Not by fixing others, but by reclaiming yourself. And in that reclamation, something extraordinary happens. You begin to really feel. Not the filtered, family-friendly emotions. The real ones, grief so ancient it has no language. Rage that doesn't burn, it purifies. Joy that isn't loud, it's rooted. You feel it all without drowning in it, because you're no longer resisting it. You've stopped fearing the depth of your own experience. And in doing so, you've stopped fearing yourself. This is what they never taught you, that your emotions are not the enemy. They are the map. They are the key. They are the invitation to become what no one in your family had the space to be. Whole. So you start to move through the world with an unfamiliar kind of quiet. A silence that doesn't come from suppression but from clarity. You are not rushing to explain yourself anymore. You're not racing to be understood. Because when you finally come into alignment with your own being, there is nothing left to prove. You do not need to be translated. You do not need to be softened. You do not need to be consumed in bite-sized versions so others can tolerate your presence. You simply are. And in that being, you begin to understand something that was never taught in the house you came from. Peace isn't the absence of chaos, it's the presence of coherence. You are no longer split in 10 directions, no longer living two lives, one inside and one outside, no longer managing the narrative others hold about you while abandoning the one you know to be true. You are unified now. Even if your life doesn't make sense to them, it makes sense to you. And that is enough, more than enough. It is everything. You start to recognize how much energy you spent in the past, micromanaging perceptions, trying to soften your boundaries so they wouldn't call you selfish, trying to hide your ambitions so they wouldn't call you arrogant, trying to disguise your intuition as logic so they wouldn't dismiss you as emotional. You played every part. You bent at every angle. And now you refuse to shape-shift for comfort. Because comfort that demands your contraction is not peace. It's imprisonment. You don't need them to understand why you needed distance. You don't need them to validate the pain you kept hidden. You don't need to reconstruct old relationships just to feel closure. You are the closure. You are the final chapter of an old book that was never going to end differently. You're the exhale at the end of generations of held breath. And you carry this knowledge now, not like a weapon, but like a lantern. You don't go around forcing others to see. You simply light your path, and those who are ready will follow. Some will, most won't, and that too no longer wounds you, because your soul is no longer bargaining with their awakening. You've stopped confusing your clarity with their readiness. You've stopped offering yourself as the bridge between what they can't admit and what you can't unsee. You're not here to drag anyone into the light. You're here to become the light. And the light does not explain itself. It simply shines. Even when it's misunderstood, even when it's rejected, even when it reveals more than others are ready to face, you don't dim anymore. Not even a little, because you remember what it cost you. And that cost was never yours to pay again. You are not a lesson. You are not a translator. You are not a metaphor for anyone's breakthrough. You are a sovereign being, and your existence now is a declaration that the pattern stops here, that the inheritance ends with you, not by rejection, but by refinement, not by anger, but by alignment, not by force, but by frequency. You are not just free from the cycle. You are the opposite of it, the embodiment of what happens when one soul chooses to evolve, even if no one else follows. You begin to notice that time feels different now, not slower, not faster, but truer. Moments don't slip through your fingers like they used to when your attention was fractured, when you were emotionally performing for approval, when you were scanning every room for threat or permission, when you were constantly measuring your value through other people's eyes. Now time moves through you, not around you, because your presence is no longer divided, your gaze is no longer turned inward in defense, your spirit is no longer rationing itself to keep others calm, and in this unified awareness, everything sharpens. Color, words, people. You feel what is real immediately. You feel what is hollow even faster. There's no longer a debate between your heart and your history, between what you know and what you were trained to accept. You know, and when you know without conflict, without apology, your choices change. You don't linger in confusion for weeks, trying to decipher energy that refuses to be honest. You don't internalize mixed signals from people who haven't yet met themselves. You don't explain your distance when your silence is your clearest truth. You act, you bless, you walk, you close. Not from fear, not from rage, from reverence for yourself, for your peace, for the clarity it took lifetimes to claim. And it's in that reverence that new life opens. People begin to appear, not the ones drawn to your wounds, but to your wholeness. Not the ones who want to fix you, mold you, manage you, but the ones who meet you as an equal, sovereign, and sacred. People who don't need you to shrink so they can rise. People who listen without projection, who stay present when you are powerful, who do not vanish when you set a boundary. And you will know the difference, because your body will not tense when they speak. Your intuition will not wince when they stay. Your breath will not shorten when they ask to see you. It won't feel like effort. It will feel like alignment. And that's what you've been creating all along, not just distance from dysfunction, but space for resonance. You're no longer driven by what you escaped. You are drawn by what you are becoming. A future so clean it terrifies the past. A vision so rooted it resists all distortion. A rhythm that no longer speeds up for chaos or slows down for comfort. Because now you trust yourself, not with hope, with certainty. And that certainty, it does not shout. It does not defend. It simply moves, unstoppable, unbothered, unmistakably yours. Eventually, you begin to realize you were never meant to fix the story. You were meant to end it. Not to rewrite the characters, not to rework the plot, not to mend the wounds of those who still wear armor and call it identity. You were meant to place the final period, gently, at the end of a sentence that's been running for generations. You were meant to say, it ends with me. And that doesn't make you the villain. It makes you the witness, the one who stayed awake when everyone else kept dreaming, the one who chose to hold the weight of truth in a family that only knew the weight of performance, the one who said no, not out of rebellion, but out of remembrance. You remembered what they forgot, that love doesn't mean erasure. That connection doesn't require the abandonment of self. That peace built on self-suppression is not peace at all, it's exile. You found your way back from that exile, and now you walk differently. There is no announcement, no crusade, no confrontation, just a shift, a quiet refusal. A refusal to carry what isn't yours. A refusal to conform to the architecture of emotional servitude. A refusal to keep pretending the old ways ever worked. Because they didn't. They merely survived, and survival is not the same as life. You were not born to survive your family. You were born to become the person they couldn't. Not out of pride, but as a prayer. Because becoming isn't about proving anything. It's about remembering everything. And remembering doesn't always mean reconciliation. Sometimes it means letting the roots grow in new soil. Sometimes it means allowing the distance to be sacred. Sometimes it means loving from afar, praying in silence, and trusting that your peace speaks louder than your presence ever could. You're not cold, you're clear, you're not detached. You're devoted to your own truth, to your own wholeness, to the blueprint of the soul that was buried beneath generations of noise. And now, as you walk forward, there is nothing chasing you. No guilt, no apology, no unresolved ache. Because healing doesn't always sound like closure. Sometimes it sounds like footsteps walking away from a pattern without turning around. Not to run, but to rise. So now, without drama or defiance, you begin the quiet work of rebuilding. Not rebuilding what was lost because nothing true was ever lost, but constructing something entirely new from the ruins of what was never real. You're not trying to recreate a version of the past with better outcomes. You're not trying to repair a house that was built on denial. You are drawing the first line on a blank page. And that is a terrifying kind of power. Because creation, true, unfiltered creation, requires you to stand in the unknown, not with control, with conviction. You don't know how it will look. You only know how it must feel. Clean, clear, rooted, honest. And so you begin. You say what you mean the first time. You stop asking questions you already know the answers to. You remove yourself from rooms where your soul has to hide. You let silence be a response. You let absence be a decision. You let discomfort be a sign that something real is taking shape. And in this new foundation, you stop asking the world to meet you where you were. You rise to meet yourself where you are. No more waiting. No more postponing your evolution to accommodate someone else's stagnation. No more carrying the dead weight of guilt, tradition, or nostalgia. You move forward not because the past was wrong, but because the future is waiting. And what's waiting isn't a destination, it's a dimension, a frequency where you are not defined by what you endured, where your strength doesn't require your suffering, where your joy is not a negotiation, where your peace is not the result of suppression, but expression, where your presence is enough not because of what you offer, but because of who you are. And in that presence, you begin to attract a new kind of gravity. People who see without projection, opportunities that align without force, moments that resonate without performance. You don't have to chase, you don't have to plead, you don't have to pretend, because you've already paid the price of pretending, and it nearly cost you everything. So now you live differently, with intention, with rhythm, with a depth that doesn't need to be loud to be known. And that life is yours, unborrowed, unbothered, unbreakable, and absolutely unapologetically real. You start to notice that your presence, your very existence, starts speaking louder than anything you could say. Not because you're louder, but because you're anchored. People feel it. They sense the difference before they can define it. You're no longer moved by the same currents that used to carry you away. You no longer explain your boundaries. You embody them. Your calm is no longer performance. It is a perimeter. And within that perimeter, only alignment can enter. It's not arrogance, it's precision. You're no longer accessible to everything and everyone just because you used to be. The version of you who was trained to overgive, to over-accommodate, to over-function in exchange for scraps of approval, that version has left the building. Not in Ra. In grace, you realize now that love isn't sacrifice. It's selection. Not everyone can go where you're going. Not because they're less, but because they're still living in a version of themselves you've already buried. And there is no judgment in that, only discernment. You begin to live by resonance, not rules. You stop asking, is this right? And start asking, is this true for me? And that shift, subtle but seismic, breaks every false agreement you ever signed in silence. The agreements that said, don't outshine us, don't leave without guilt, don't evolve too fast, or you'll be alone. But you are no longer ruled by fear of being alone, because solitude is no longer a punishment. It's a sanctuary. It's where you touch the fabric of your own soul, where you hear your truest voice without static, where you remember that before you were shaped by them, by family, by culture, by collective patterns, you were whole. And now you live from that place, whole, undivided, rooted in a reality that cannot be explained to the unready. And that's the final lesson. You don't need to convince anyone anymore. Not your mother, not your father, not the siblings still lost in the script, not the friends who preferred your past. You've outgrown the need for witnesses because you were there. You watched yourself rise from the ashes they said weren't burning. You heard your own voice emerge from beneath centuries of silence. You felt your own heart choose itself in a room full of ghosts asking you to stay dead. And that is more than enough. That is everything. Because that moment, that choice, that sacred rebellion, where you refuse to keep the pattern alive, that is where the lineage ends. And where legacy begins, you are the moment the pattern broke. Not in chaos, not in cruelty, but in clarity, You did not come to wage war against your bloodline. You came to bless it differently. To walk into the fire they feared and make a home in the truth they couldn't touch. To feel it all. To say what was never said. To name what was never allowed to exist. And in doing so, you became the first one in generations to turn pain into prophecy. Not by running from it, by facing it and refusing to pass it on. You no longer confuse love with labor. You no longer carry shame as a birthright. You no longer abandon yourself for the illusion of harmony, because now, family pain is not a fault. It is a pattern, and patterns are not destiny. They are decisions, and you, without fanfare, without approval, without applause, made the decision to live from truth, to walk with integrity, to no longer hold your breath in the rooms where you were told who to be. And now the air is yours. You breathe differently. You move with purpose. You speak with precision. You look in the mirror and finally see not who they needed you to be, but who you are. Fully, finally, and forever free.